Imagine a world where your journey to faith's holiest sites was a gamble with death, where ancient Christian lands were carved away and your neighbors forcibly converted. This was the grim reality that ignited a firestorm across Europe. This video will pull back the curtain on a critical, often misunderstood period in history, the centuries leading up to the Crusades. For centuries, the land bridge connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa was a melting pot of cultures, religions, and empires. But by the late 11th century, the air was thick with tension, a simmering pot of political ambition and religious fervor. This was a time when the balance of power was dramatically shifting. What we refer to today as Saracens, a term used by Europeans to describe various Muslim peoples during the Middle Ages, were not a single unified entity. They were diverse groups, from nomadic tribes to established caliphates, whose influence had grown immensely. Their rise corresponded with a noticeable decline in the political and military might of Christian states in the region. This dynamic wasn't just a casual change in leadership, it was a profound transformation that would set the stage for an unprecedented response from the Christian West. The stage was set not for peaceful coexistence, but for a clash of civilizations, ultimately leading to the call for the First Crusade. One of the most potent grievances, whispered in markets and preached from pulpits across Europe, concerned the treatment of Christian pilgrims. For devout Christians, a journey to the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, the birthplace of Christ, was the ultimate act of faith, a sacred pilgrimage that could cleanse sins and guarantee entry into heaven. Imagine planning for years, saving every penny, saying goodbye to your family, knowing this might be your last voyage. Now imagine that journey, not as a spiritual quest, but as a gauntlet of terror. By the 11th century, many of the crucial routes and territories leading to these hallowed sites, including Jerusalem itself, were under Saracen control. This wasn't always a problem. For a time, under certain rulers, pilgrims could travel with relative safety, sometimes even with the permission of local Muslim authorities, though often for a fee. But as the political landscape became more fragmented and local rulers more opportunistic, the situation for pilgrims deteriorated sharply. Accounts from the time, collected and circulated throughout Europe, paint a grim picture. Pilgrims were frequently subjected to harassment, not just by organized forces, but by bandits and opportunistic groups who saw them as easy targets. Robberies were rampant. Imagine walking for weeks, carrying your life savings to buy passage or offer alms, only to have it all violently ripped away, leaving you stranded and penniless in a foreign land. These weren't isolated incidents. They became a common, terrifying reality. But it wasn't just about money. The stories that truly ignited outrage were those of murder. Travelers were attacked, sometimes for resistance, sometimes out of sheer malice. The sanctity of their religious journey meant nothing to their attackers. Some accounts even describe pilgrims being tortured or left to die in the harsh desert. Pilgrimage to the Holy Land had become an incredibly dangerous undertaking. These tales of suffering and martyrdom did not stay contained within the Holy Land. They traveled back to Europe, carried by the few who survived, by merchants, and by returning clergy. They spread like wildfire through towns and villages, whispered in homes and shouted from pulpits. Every account of a robbed or murdered pilgrim was another drop in the bucket of popular outrage. This wasn't just about personal loss. It was seen as an insult to God, a direct affront to Christian faith. The common people, alongside their religious leaders, began to feel a profound moral obligation. They believed it was their duty to protect their fellow Christians, to ensure that the path to God's city was safe once more. This growing sense of injustice and the urgent need for intervention formed a powerful emotional bedrock for what was to come. Beyond the plight of individual pilgrims, there was a larger, more systemic grievance that fueled the fires of crusading zeal: the vast territorial expansion of Saracen power across the Mediterranean and Middle East. This wasn't just about skirmishes. It was about the systematic conquest and assimilation of historically Christian lands, leading to the subjugation of millions. The map of the ancient Christian world was being redrawn before their very eyes. Think about the legacy of Christianity. It wasn't born in Europe. It emerged in the Middle East. Many of these regions had embraced Christianity centuries before most of Europe. Yet, by the 11th century, these ancient Christian heartlands were increasingly under Muslim rule. This wasn't just a political change. It often brought with it profound cultural and religious shifts for the native Christian populations. Consider Egypt, a land with a Christian history stretching back to the earliest apostles. It was the birthplace of monasticism, a hub of theological thought, and home to the ancient Coptic Christian Church. For centuries, its people had been predominantly Christian. However, with the Arab conquests in the 7th century, Egypt fell under Muslim rule. Over time, through a combination of migration, incentives for conversion, and at times, social and economic pressures, the Christian majority began to shrink. Under Saracen rule, Coptic Christians, while generally tolerated as people of the book, found themselves in a subordinate position. They were subject to special taxes, known as the jizya, which non-Muslims paid for protection and the right to practice their faith. While this system allowed for the survival of the Coptic Church, it often came with social limitations and occasional periods of harsh persecution, particularly during the rule of more fanatical leaders. They were, in effect, second-class citizens in their own ancestral land. Their ancient churches still stood, but their influence waned, their numbers dwindled, and their culture was increasingly marginalized. This transformation of a once vibrant Christian heartland into a territory governed by Islamic law was a stark reminder to European Christians of what could happen if nothing was done. Even further east lay Armenia, a rugged, mountainous land with an even more remarkable claim to Christian history. It was the first nation in the world to adopt Christianity as its state religion, all the way back in 300 Hoain AD. For centuries, Armenia had been a bulwark of Christian faith, often caught between powerful empires. But with the rise of Saracen power, Armenia faced wave after wave of incursions. From the 7th century onwards, Armenian lands were frequently raided and conquered by various Arab and later Turkic dynasties, all falling under the broader Saracen umbrella from a European perspective. The Armenian people endured periods of intense suffering under foreign rule. While complete forced conversions on a mass scale were not always the primary policy, many individuals, particularly those seeking to avoid crippling taxes or gain social advancement, converted to Islam. More significantly, the Armenian Church itself and the Christian population as a whole were subjected to heavy taxation and systematic oppression aimed at weakening their cultural and religious identity. There are countless historical records and laments from Armenian chroniclers detailing the brutal suppression of their Christian faith and culture. Churches were sometimes desecrated or converted into mosques. Religious leaders were imprisoned or executed. The Christian calendar and holidays were often suppressed. Imagine living under a system where your ancestral faith is constantly under threat, where your children might be taken or your right to worship openly is restricted. The Armenians, a fiercely independent and devout people, fiercely resisted, but their endurance came at a great cost. Their ongoing struggle and the stories of their suffering resonated deeply with European Christians who saw them as fellow believers holding the line against overwhelming odds. These were not isolated incidents. From Spain in the west to the Byzantine borders in the east, the expansion of Muslim power had fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape. Sicily, a Christian island for centuries, had fallen to Muslim rule. Parts of southern Italy were under constant threat. Antioch, a city central to early Christianity, was under Muslim control. The cumulative effect of these conquests was a widespread and deeply felt sense of religious persecution among European Christians. It wasn't just about distant lands. It was about the very fabric of Christendom being torn apart. These losses contributed to immense political instability throughout the region, fueling anxieties and fears in the West. Leaders sought to expand their influence, secure borders, and enrich their domains, much like any other power bloc of the era. However, the religious context undeniably provided a powerful ideological framework for both the expansion itself and, more importantly, for the Christian reaction to it. For centuries, European Christians had been hearing news, often fragmented and delayed, about the plight of their co-religionists in the East. But as the 11th century wore on, the volume of these grievances intensified, and the threat grew more immediate. The belief that Islam was relentlessly encroaching upon Christian lands and that countless Christians were suffering under their rule became a potent rallying cry. This narrative was powerfully amplified by the stories of lost territories, ancient bishoprics now under foreign rule. It was reinforced by accounts of forced conversions, though the extent and nature of these varied widely by region and ruler. And perhaps most viscerally, it was stoked by tales of the desecration of Christian sites, churches turned into mosques, relics reportedly defiled. These widespread grievances, the terror faced by pilgrims, the subjugation of ancient Christian communities, and the loss of holy sites didn't just exist in isolation. They coalesced into a powerful, undeniable tide of indignation and moral imperative. The call to the First Crusade, initiated by Pope Urban II in 1095, was not merely a spontaneous outburst. It was the culmination of decades, even centuries, of growing tension, fear, and outrage. It was presented as a holy mission to protect suffering Christians, to reclaim the revered Holy Land, and to push back against what was seen as an aggressive, unstoppable Islamic expansion. The time for passive observation was over. The time for holy war had arrived. Subscribe to Foxhole History.